There's a moment most people never forget. The moment they realize being good to someone did not make them more valued. It made them easier to overlook. And the terrifying part is how quietly it happens. Not through betrayal. Not through conflict. Not through some dramatic ending. But through slow emotional adaptation. You answer faster. You become more available. More understanding. More patient. More forgiving. You think consistency creates emotional importance. But eventually, your presence stops creating impact because it stops feeling uncertain. And people rarely admit how much attraction changes once emotional access feels guaranteed. That's the part nobody says out loud. Because most people want to believe kindness automatically creates deeper attachment. But emotionally, people often react more intensely to what they might lose than what they already fully possess. And that realization changes something inside you. Especially when you notice the shift happening in real time. The delayed replies. The reduced curiosity. The conversations becoming shorter. The enthusiasm becoming procedural. You start feeling it before you fully understand it. The emotional atmosphere changes first. You can hear it in their voice. You can feel it in the pauses. You notice yourself becoming the person maintaining the emotional energy while they slowly relax into emotional certainty. And eventually you realize something disturbing. You are no longer being emotionally experienced. You are being emotionally expected. That changes everything. Because attention behaves differently once it no longer feels voluntary. The frightening part is how invisible this process becomes while it's happening. At first, you tell yourself they're just tired. Then stressed. Then distracted. Then emotionally overwhelmed. So you become even more understanding. You lower your emotional expectations to maintain connection. You become easier to disappoint. And most people never notice how dangerous that moment is. Because that's usually where emotional imbalance begins. You start appreciating things that once felt basic. A fast reply suddenly feels exciting. A little affection feels emotionally relieving. A small compliment affects your entire mood. And slowly, you begin measuring your emotional worth through reactions that used to happen naturally. That's when attachment starts quietly reshaping your personality. You stop speaking naturally. You start speaking carefully. You reread messages before sending them. You debate whether double texting makes you look desperate. You pretend not to care while checking whether they viewed your story. You become emotionally performative around someone who once made you feel emotionally safe. And the humiliating part is realizing how much emotional power they now have over your internal state. One delayed response can ruin your night. One cold interaction can make you overanalyze yourself for hours. One moment of distance suddenly feels psychologically threatening. Because emotional inconsistency creates obsession faster than consistency ever could. People rarely become addicted to stable attention. They become addicted to uncertainty. To wondering. To waiting. To emotional unpredictability. That's why people sometimes miss the anxiety more than the person. And most don't realize that until much later. You notice it in tiny moments first. They laugh harder with someone else. They respond faster in group chats than they do to you. They suddenly sound emotionally alive around strangers while conversations with you feel exhausted. And something inside you quietly collapses. Because nothing feels more humiliating than watching someone give effortless attention to others that you had to emotionally fight for. Especially when you remember how naturally it once happened. That's what destroys people emotionally. Not the rejection itself. The comparison. The contrast. The realization that the emotional intensity you treasured became ordinary to the other person. And the darker truth is, being excessively nice often accelerates this process. Because constant emotional availability slowly removes tension. No uncertainty. No emotional risk. No psychological challenge. Just emotional predictability. And familiarity changes observation. People stop noticing what always stays. That applies to almost everything. Even affection. Especially affection. You can see it happen in relationships that technically still exist. Conversations become updates instead of emotional experiences. Did you eat? How was work? What are you doing? The connection remains alive structurally. But emotionally, something already disappeared months ago. And both people can feel it. Nobody says it directly. But the emotional atmosphere becomes colder. Silences become heavier. Eye contact becomes shorter. The relationship slowly shifts from emotional desire to emotional maintenance. That's when people start searching for stimulation outside the relationship without even realizing why. Not always physically. Sometimes emotionally. Sometimes psychologically. They start enjoying attention from strangers more than affection from the person beside them. Because novelty creates observation. And familiarity often destroys it. That truth feels cruel because it is. People stop emotionally reacting to what feels permanently available. That's why emotionally nice people often become emotionally invisible over time. Not because they lack value, but because their emotional presence stops creating tension. And tension affects attention more than comfort does. That realization hurts most when you notice yourself shrinking emotionally, trying to regain reactions that once happened naturally. You become more agreeable, more careful, more forgiving. You tolerate things you once would have immediately rejected. You act emotionally detached while internally panicking. You suppress needs because you're afraid honesty will create distance. And eventually, you become emotionally exhausted from trying to maintain emotional importance inside someone else's mind. That's when identity damage begins. You stop asking yourself what you actually feel. You start asking what keeps them emotionally interested. That shift destroys people quietly. Because now your emotional state depends on external reactions. You become hyper-aware of mood changes. Tone changes. Attention changes. Energy changes. You notice when they stop asking deeper questions. You notice when they stop reacting to your absence. You notice when your silence no longer creates emotional curiosity. And nothing feels colder than realizing your emotional presence no longer changes someone's atmosphere. Especially when it once did. That's the part people struggle admitting out loud. Sometimes the person who cares more slowly becomes less attractive precisely because they care more visibly. Not because caring is wrong, but because emotional certainty changes perceived value. People become psychologically lazy with what feels permanently secured. And eventually, you feel yourself becoming emotionally tolerated instead of emotionally desired. There's a difference. A painful one. Desired people create emotional tension naturally. Tolerated people create emotional comfort. And comfort rarely creates obsession. That's why emotional withdrawal feels so powerful. The moment attention disappears, people suddenly notice its value again. Not always because love deepened. Sometimes because uncertainty returned. And uncertainty immediately activates emotional focus. People notice absence faster than presence. That truth destroys a lot of illusions. Especially for people who believed loyalty automatically guaranteed emotional appreciation. It doesn't. Sometimes loyalty simply teaches people you'll stay no matter how little effort they give. And once someone fully believes that, the emotional dynamics change completely. You start becoming emotionally safe instead of emotionally stimulating. Predictable instead of intriguing. Guaranteed instead of psychologically engaging. That's when people start saying things like, "I don't know what changed." Even though the shift happened slowly over months. Through repetition. Through overexposure. Through emotional certainty. Through constant reassurance. Through becoming too emotionally reachable. And the terrifying part is how many people destroy their emotional leverage trying to prove love harder. More attention. More effort. More patience. More emotional availability. As if increasing emotional access automatically increases emotional value. But emotionally, scarcity often creates stronger psychological impact than abundance. That's why people suddenly become fascinated once attention disappears. That's why distance creates overthinking. That's why silence creates emotional obsession. And that realization feels deeply unfair when you were the one who genuinely cared. Because the nicer you become, the more emotionally replaceable you sometimes start feeling. Not immediately. Gradually. Quietly. Until one day you realize you're carrying conversations that used to carry themselves. You're sustaining emotional intensity alone. You're trying to recreate chemistry that once happened effortlessly. And deep down, you already know the emotional balance changed a long time ago. You just didn't want to admit it. Because admitting it forces another realization. Sometimes people don't emotionally miss you until your emotional access disappears. And that realization humiliates people. Especially those who spent months proving loyalty, patience, consistency, and emotional availability hoping it would deepen attachment. Only to discover, people often emotionally chase what feels uncertain more intensely than what feels guaranteed. That's why emotionally nice people often suffer silently. They keep giving while slowly feeling less seen, less valued, less noticed, until eventually they stop recognizing themselves. You can always tell when someone became emotionally dependent on another person's reactions. They start celebrating basic decency like it's affection. They feel relief over simple replies. They become grateful for attention that once felt normal. And slowly, their standards collapse without them realizing it. That's what emotional imbalance does. It changes what feels acceptable. The terrifying part is realizing how much disrespect people tolerate once attachment becomes strong enough. Because attachment makes people negotiate against themselves. They silence instincts. Ignore emotional discomfort. Pretend inconsistency doesn't hurt. Pretend emotional distance isn't obvious. Pretend reduced effort still feels loving. All to avoid confronting the possibility that the emotional intensity already died. And sometimes, it did. Long before either person left. That's why people stay emotionally confused for months. The relationship still exists physically. But psychologically, the emotional atmosphere already changed. The warmth feels thinner. The attention feels mechanical. The excitement feels historical. You stop missing who they are. You start missing how intensely they used to notice you. That distinction ruins people emotionally. Because it forces them to confront something deeply uncomfortable. Maybe they were never addicted to the person. Maybe they were addicted to feeling emotionally important to someone. And once that feeling disappears, panic begins. Overthinking begins. Emotional chasing begins. That's when people start abandoning their own dignity trying to restore emotional reactions that no longer happen naturally. And most people don't notice the damage until much later. By then, they've already reshaped themselves emotionally around someone else's fading attention. That's the darkest part. Not rejection. Transformation. The quiet way attachment changes your behavior while convincing you it's love. Until eventually you look at yourself and realize you became emotionally smaller just to remain emotionally included. And the frightening part is, many people never fully recover their sense of emotional self after that. Because once someone becomes emotionally responsible for your internal stability, silence starts feeling dangerous. Distance starts feeling threatening. And being ignored starts feeling like proof you were never truly valued at all. If this felt uncomfortably familiar, subscribe for more psychological explorations of human behavior.